What responsibilities and ethical challenges emerge when humans intervene to restore ecosystems? Can competing priorities, such as economic profit versus environmental justice, ever be brought into alignment? Who bears accountability to ensure that artificial intelligence, one of the most rapidly growing technologies with a startling rate of resource consumption, becomes environmentally sustainable? And perhaps most importantly, how might we bring conversations about environmental conservation and land use into a nonpartisan arena, even when there may be deep ideological divisions? These are some of the ethical questions and concerns the Roger Mudd Center for Ethics will highlight and address during this year's multidisciplinary program, Taking Place: Land Use and Environmental Impact. Over the year, we will delve into different meanings of taking place. We will begin with exploring the environmental, human, and political consequences of mining lithium, an element integral to developing green technologies. Its mining in the country of Chile raises complex dilemmas and questions about what an ethical energy transition from fossil fuels to green technologies may look like. We'll continue our investigation of fossil fuels by examining the lands designated for petroleum refineries, often places with vulnerable populations. The year-long series will also address community-led land use interventions that are taking place and aspiring to promote biodiversity through rewilding practices and soil rejuvenation efforts. These are, of course, not without their own ethical issues, which we'll also navigate. Framing this year's inquiry is an exhibition of Edward Burtynsky's commanding large-form color photographs that capture the magnitude of the natural world marked and affected by human industry, such as steel production in China, artificial salt evaporation ponds in Senegal, massive irrigation systems in the Netherlands, as well as coal, uranium, and gold mines in South Africa. At once compelling and troubling, these landscapes capture the disturbing aftermath of industrial processes used to maintain a growing global population. Through this photographic exhibition, along with the accompanying lecture series and community engagement, the Mudd Center for Ethics looks forward to welcoming you and to engaging with you about the scope of interconnected issues related to land use and its environmental impact from both global and local perspectives. Good evening. Can you hear me? You can hear me. Okay. Sorry, this is a really beautiful turnout. Does that help? Can you hear me? Yeah, okay, good. So good evening. My name is Melissa Karen. I'm the director of the Mudd Center for Ethics here on campus. And it's wonderful to welcome you here this evening to launch this year's program. I think we'll first start with a land acknowledgement. The Mudd Center respectfully acknowledges that we inhabit unceded ancestral lands of indigenous nations still governing in the Shenandoah Valley, such as the Monacan, and some displaced from it. This land of Virginia and of our own university has been worked and built by a legacy of unfree labor and indentured servitude. Our land acknowledgement is poignantly connected to this year's Mudd series entitled Taking Place, Land Use and Environmental Impact. And if the title doesn't give it away, this year is a fully rigorous, compelling inquiry into environmental ethics for the year. It's a theme that was informed by student interest, faculty interest, and research, and the university's own strategic plan, which makes environmental stewardship a top priority. Over the past 9 months, I've had the pleasure of meeting with many colleagues who have helped guide and nudge the Mudd Center in productive directions as we shaped and defined and refined the scope of the year. I'm deeply grateful, and I know that my two colleagues, Kate Sacchi, who's in the back, and my other colleague at Mudd, our new postdoc, Danielle Ranweiler, join me in thanking all of my colleagues who were so helpful over the year. I think of you as a kind of steering committee who helped us, and I'm trying to find some of you, I know you're out there, but as a kind of steering committee who helped us shape this year. These collaborative efforts have produced a very strong multidisciplinary program investigating the complex interplay of land use and the environment, with a particular focus on issues related to green technologies, biodiversity, and health. All of the events that we offer you can see on our website, and there is a lot this year. So I do encourage you to go to the website and see what our programming is for the year in terms of various lectures, but we also have a documentary viewing, a symposium, various conversations, and community engagement. I also want to thank my colleague, Leanne Beavers, for the image that you see here, which is the emblem of today or this year's theme. Her rendering of the white thorn branch draws attention to an overlooked endangered species and its many micro ecosystems. She'll share more of her work on during the Rewilding Symposium that we'll have in February. Just as Leanne's artwork studies ecosystems that go unnoticed, today's keynote speaker turns our attention to other hidden ethical issues embedded within the practice of lithium extraction and the rise of green technologies. We are thrilled to welcome Dr. Thea Riofrancos, Associate Professor of Political Science at Providence College in Rhode Island. Her award-winning scholarship on resource extraction, renewable energy, and the global lithium sector has established her as one of the leading figures in the field. Dr. Riofrancos has authored 2 books, one in 2020, which, yes, was award-winning, and this new one that's coming out, technically the publishing date is in about 2 weeks, but we were lucky enough to get early copies of it. All of our Mudd Fellows will be able to have a copy of it, and there are a few copies, I think, available in the bookstore. Along with these publications, she's co-authored another volume, received major national prestigious fellowships, and has published numerous articles, both public-facing and academic. Today's keynote draws on her forthcoming book, Extraction: The Frontiers of Green Capitalism, which examines the human and environmental costs of lithium mining in Chile, Portugal, and even in the United States and Nevada. Her work resonates strongly with the photographic exhibition currently on view at the Reeves Museum here on our campus, Edward Bertinsky Taking Place, which was curated by Pat Hobbs. This was another collaboration that we had with art museums and galleries and with MUD. So that was a really wonderful opportunity to bring this extraordinary work on campus, and it will be here for several months for you to enjoy. The exhibition documents extractive practices throughout the world. And given the connection between Dr. Riofrancos' work and the exhibition, we invite you all to join us for a viewing and a reception immediately following Thea's talk. So I will say that after her talk, we will be in a little bit of a crunch to leave this space and move over to the Reeves Museum. So we have another event coming in 6:30-ish, so at 6:30. So we'll need to be out of here before that, and just follow the masses out over to Reeves Museum. So without further ado, let me have you help me welcome our guest, Thea Riofrancos.
Okay, just bear with me a moment. I have to.
Make your finger and hopefully.
Oh, I think I need Kate.
Yeah, Kate.
So sorry. I can't see anything, of course.
She's coming.
Oh, she's coming. Okay. Sorry, I should have done this before. Anyway, I'll just start talking a little bit, just because I always have some opening remarks that I'll just start on, and while we get the presentation up. So thank you so much for coming. Thank you so much for those that warm introduction, Melissa, to Kate and Dan as well for coordinating this. You'll see my slideshow come up in a moment, and that will have the title of today's talk, which is a little different than the title of my book, but draws on the same set of material. Excellent, thank you so much. That was so fast. It's around back. Yeah. All right. So I want to say just a real brief set of kind of introductory remarks before I dive in. One is, as I said, this isn't the title of my book, but it's the title of the talk. And what that is to indicate is that, you know, I'm not an ethicist, I'm not a philosopher of ethics, but this talk was a really interesting opportunity to think through the ethical dimensions of my work, which are implicitly clear to me, but not what I always draw out. So that's one piece, and so I think there are moments where the ethical stuff will become very clear. There are other moments where I have to kind of share context and other knowledge just about my general research. Another couple of notes. This talk is a little bit of a 30,000-foot view of research that I did over 6 years, research and writing that I did over 6 years. Just reading the room, and I've met students today and met colleagues and faculty today, there are going to be moments that for some folks are a little technical. I won't dwell too long on those, but there's also some energy nerds in the room, so I want them to kind of have that piece. There are other moments that I think would speak to anyone in this room, right? So if there's a moment where you feel like, I've never heard that word before, and I'll do my best to define as I go along, don't worry, we're moving quickly, so the next slide will hopefully have something that's of interest to you. But I just like to tell people to not feel nervous when they're getting introduced to some new technical language, political economy language, and also language of ethics and social justice. So, with that, okay, I'm so sorry. Okay, I will get used to this. All right, so I want to start my talk where my research started. I first went to Chile in January of 2019, and I found myself in a really remarkable extractive frontier and social ecological landscape. And so this is kind of our first view of it. What this is showing us is the Atacama Salt Flat, which is an enormous salt flat. I come from Rhode Island, or I come from New York City originally, but I've lived in Rhode Island for a decade. Rhode Island's a small state. But what I'll tell you is that this salt flat is 2/3 the size of the state of Rhode Island, just to give you a sense of scale. And surrounding it, kind of way in the background, are the Andean Mountains. It's an enormous and very high altitude mountain range. Some of those mountains are volcanic. And what you're seeing kind of more frontally here is what a lithium mine looks like when it's a brine deposit. Not every type of lithium mine is this type of deposit, but this is an interesting one. The lithium is actually underground in subsoil liquid. It's pumped to the surface, and then it's arrayed on these evaporation ponds. Solar radiation helps evaporate the liquid, therefore leaving a more concentrated lithium chemical behind, and then that enters into lithium batteries. We'll come back to that. But this is the landscape that you're looking at from a few different kind of aerial views. But this is the kind of more view of a human being or an animal on the same landscape. So about 19 miles from those same lithium mines that I just pointed out is actually a nature preserve, because it's a beautiful and quite interesting and scientifically fascinating natural environment in which, for example, endemic flamingos snack on all sorts of organisms in surface level salty lagoons. And even within these lagoons and underneath the ground in the lithium deposits themselves, there's a whole wealth of microbial life that scientists are just beginning to understand. And so this is what this beautiful landscape, people come from all over the world to visit these salt flats because they're so stunning. But, you know, it's not just a landscape of animals and sort of natural beauty, it's also a landscape of human habitation. And for thousands of years, indigenous people have lived in this landscape, they have farmed, they have figured out, despite this being the driest desert on Earth, and the second driest place on Earth outside of a sub-region of the Antarctica that is slightly drier. So this is one of the driest places on Earth. This is the type of agriculture that indigenous knowledge has been able to produce over time. And so around that same salt flat, that is 2/3 the size of my home state of Rhode Island, there are 18 indigenous communities that live around it and that interact in all sorts of ways, cultural, through their livelihoods, through local ecologies, with that landscape. And so what I began to learn as I spent time in Chile is that lithium, a substance I was just beginning to learn about and the world was just beginning to really think concertedly about, again, this is 2019 when I first went there, was imbricated in this really complex set of landscapes, cultural practices, place, and was having some unfortunate impacts on that landscape. The water was seeming scarcer, the biodiversity was lowering, and indigenous rights were not being respected, right? So this is, again, my entry point. I'm learning about lithium mining. I'm learning about its pretty devastating and concerning local impacts. And then I'm learning about the kind of pre-existing environment that surrounds it. But it was really after that first stint of field work and over the years that followed that I really grasped the more world historical importance, right? Not to downplay the local impacts of a local set of mines, which are fascinating in their own right always. But there's always a bigger global story as to where extraction takes place, why it takes place, who it benefits, and who pays the cost. And so in this case, I began to learn in a way as the world began to learn, because this issue became much more salient a year or 2 years, 3 years into my research than it did when I first started, was that lithium was now being considered a, quote, critical mineral for the energy transition. And so I'm going to unpack that term a little bit, not presuming any knowledge in the room of what critical mineral means or what energy transition means, and just start with kind of the basics. So what a critical mineral is, and this is according to the US government and other governments define it similarly, is a mineral that is essential for the economy and or national security. Those terms tend to get conflated, so it's economically important, it's security important, and also where there's some concern that maybe we won't be able to reliably access this mineral. So it has to be important for the economy, important for national security, and there's some concern, whether it's scarcity, disruption, concentration of supply, where we're not sure we'll be able to easily access it. In the case of lithium, what's so important about lithium is that it is a non-substitutable element in lithium-ion batteries, hence the name lithium-ion batteries. Demand is expected to grow very quickly. And so there's concern, will there be enough, right? And also just general emphasis on this mineral because it's so important to a major process that societies around the world are undertaking in uneven ways, which is to eliminate carbon from our economies, right, and from our societies, and to replace carbon-polluting infrastructure and technologies with ones that do not do that. And so what lithium does and what the lithium battery does is allow you to take the carbon out of the transportation sector, in theory. And it's worth noting that the transportation sector is the #1 source of carbon pollution in the United States and the #2 source globally. So lithium's a hot commodity, in other words, right? And so what we can see, and I won't dwell too long here, but it's just to say that every forecasting agency, from the International Energy Agency to the World Bank to the IMF, says lithium demand is going to go up, 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 because we need to replace all the cars on the road and all the future cars with cars that run on lithium batteries. The catch is that despite lithium actually being geologically abundant, and there's a tricky thing with critical minerals where we presume, oh, they're really scarce, there's not enough of them underground. That's not the case. There's a lot of lithium out there. It's like the 30th most abundant element. But the issue is that right now there's a few places that kind of dominate production, and so you're not mining lithium everywhere. And so if a lithium is in hot demand and it's concentrated in a few countries, then policymakers and economists and others tend to worry, maybe we're not going to be able to get access to it. And there has been a real issue in the past few years, even in the course of me studying this, of what are called supply and demand imbalances. What that means is certain moments where there's not quite enough lithium, there's enough underground, but there's not enough available on the market for car companies and battery companies to buy. And then there are other moments that are the opposite, where there's too much available and the price goes down, and then there's concerns about profitability and can we get more investment in the sector. And so just to illustrate that, a few years ago, this is 2022, lithium prices were through the roof, and for the first time ever in the history of the lithium-ion battery, which dates to the mid-'70s, batteries were starting to get more expensive, not less. Because, oftentimes innovation works so that things and technologies get cheaper over time. That was starting to be called into question because the raw material prices were getting so high. Then there was kind of an oversupply, and this is a typical commodity market dynamic for those of you familiar with commodities like oil or copper, where they kind of go in these boom and bust cycles, and we have that with lithium. And in fact, lithium has been called the most volatile commodity of the past decade. So the price then crashed. And so now there's a new problem. If the price crashes, will people invest in it, right? And so I'm just giving you a taste of kind of how policymakers, economists, people in the business world think about this. We're going to take a lot more angles than that, but this helps situate why there's so much attention on this mineral. And so for all of these reasons, lithium is considered, quote, critical. But I want to kind of make an argument. This is kind of the first argument that I'm going to make. Everything else I just told you, you could have read in a newspaper, perhaps. But I'm going to sort of start making a few interventions. The first is that calling something a critical mineral is not just like a neutral descriptor. Once bureaucrats, politicians, corporations, et cetera, start saying this mineral is critical or that mineral is critical, what happens, and we'll see this very clearly throughout the talk, is that there are new forms of state power and new arenas of corporate profit. That may or may not be a bad thing. I'm just saying that neutrally for now, but I want to make that claim that when a state or a government entity says this mineral is really important, new forms of state power are opened up to secure that mineral, and it also becomes a signal to investors that this is going to be an important market, so maybe you should get your money in it. So there's effects of declaring that something is a critical mineral. But there's a lot of other questions we might want to ask that are covered over and effaced by that designation. Because once someone says this is critical, it's really important, or this is essential for national security, oftentimes we just shut down debate. Like, I guess we need this thing. We need it for technology. We need it for the climate crisis. We need it for national security. We need it to beat China. These are the discourses that are out there. And then we forget to ask certain questions, like exactly who is it critical for? Exactly what is it critical for? Is there a way in which this kind of consensus that certain minerals are critical actually kind of shuts down debate and distracts us from more important ethical, normative, political questions about what type of energy transition we want, about who's going to profit from that energy transition, who's going to grow more powerful from that energy transition, and who's going to pay the cost of that power and profit in an unequal USA and an unequal globe. And so what I want to look at instead of just assuming, oh, lithium's a critical mineral, full stop, end of story, let's move on, is to say, actually, this is the beginning of a set of debates. It's the beginning of a set of contentions, and that if we look at the broader supply chain, if we go from lithium mining to battery production to electric vehicle consumption, there's a whole set of interesting processes, geopolitical processes of geopolitical conflict, corporate competition that can get very cutthroat, communities organizing against mining or against corporate investments that they don't like. And so what I've found in my research is that rather than it just be a kind of simple fact, this is critical, we're gonna extract more, we're gonna beat China, we're gonna build a lot of electric vehicles, instead there's a whole contentious political economy that is quite interesting and full of conflict. And so the approach that I take as a political scientist, though someone that dips into lots of other disciplines as well, I look a lot at heterodox economics, I look at anthropology, geography, history, in terms of understanding kind of the history and present and potential future of these conflicts. I try to zoom in on 3 sets of actors that I think are really interesting and important to understand why this is so contentious and what the stakes of the contention are. And so I'll start us off with governments. That's partly because I'm a political scientist, as I just mentioned, and I think governments and states are important and the sort of domain of politics is important, but also because in extractive sectors, and I think this will, again, become clear as the talk goes on, in sectors like oil and mining, states tend to take a really important role. It's not just a realm of corporations and markets, it's also a realm of geopolitics and national security. So governments are going to be in there. We're also going to look at firms. I refer to them as the green capitalists, and we're going to look at social movements. And so those are our actors. I will not dwell on this too much, but just so you know, I went to a lot of places and did a lot of field work and talked to a lot of people over multiple years. And maybe just to say briefly, my background is really in studying Latin America. But this project, through serendipity, and I'm happy to tell the little anecdote later over the reception or whenever, through a kind of serendipity, I ended up in Europe, and then through that, I ended up realizing also in the US, there's a lot going on that has to do with this. So this is my first really transnational study that I've embarked on, and the first time that I'm also studying the global north as well as the global south. And that produced a lot of really interesting connections and parallels as well as contrasts. And I'm gonna say one other preamble note, and then I'm gonna dive into all of this stuff, which is to say those questions about ethics and about justice are going to be where we end up in this. But I think in order to understand, as I said, the kind of contours and stakes of the conflicts over the energy transition, we need to kind of understand what I'm going to walk us through, and then we're going to land in thinking, what would a more ethical energy transition look like? So starting with our state actors, this is how they think about things. These are headlines from a few years ago, and every time I think, let me update them, the headlines are the same. And so this discourse has gotten very consolidated in Europe, in the United States. And as you can see, despite what I just said, that lithium's rather abundant and that we don't need to be freaked out that we're about to run out of it, state actors act as if we do because they know that that's a way to kind of escalate concern and maybe enable and unlock certain policy powers that maybe wouldn't be available to them if there wasn't a concern about scarcity. But there's also a just general escalation and bellicosity around all of these new technology supply chains, whether electric vehicles or semiconductors. They have become sites of geopolitical tension, especially between the US and China, but also Europe has its angle as well in that tension. So what I want to do, and bear with me for a moment, there's going to be a really brief history lesson, but I think it's helpful to understand, let me go back a moment because I know people will read while I'm talking about something else and that will be distracting for everyone. We want to understand, like, when did states first start talking this way? Now, that's a kind of silly way to put it because we could go back hundreds and hundreds of years, right? But like more proximately, when did it happen that global north states, the most powerful states in the world system, started to get really worried about their access to basic raw materials? Because they weren't always so worried about that. In fact, they used to get them through colonialism and imperialism and war, but at a certain point, they started to get worried, and I wanted to understand where these languages came from. And so I did some digging, and I'm not a historian, so it was interesting new learning for me. I learned that it really emanated from the 1970s. And some of the older folks in the room lived through this, and those that are more my age, our parents lived through this, right? In the 1970s, there was a lot of concern about an oil crisis and an energy crisis. And I won't walk us through that whole history, but I will just say two facts about it, which are listed up there. which is that part of the reason Western powers, I'm using Western and Global North interchangeably for this talk, so Western powers, Europe, UK, US, et cetera, were so worried about energy and oil is because in the 70s, a lot of then called third world countries nationalized their oil, took control of their oil, the price of oil went up. In response to that, Global North policymakers started using language like, we need resource security, we need energy security, we need to be independent of these volatile governments that we no longer control. How are we going to do that? Well, there were some coups, there was some soft power, but also there was opening up of resource extraction within the US and UK. So Alaska, oil drilling in Alaska, oil drilling in the Gulf of Mexico, oil drilling in the North Sea off of the United Kingdom. That really takes off in the 70s. That's going to become important. So try to remember that fact because we see a similar thing happening right now with critical minerals. So that dates to the 70s. In 2008, this is the next moment that Western powers start to feel like they're losing their footing. And there's a couple reasons. There's a major financial crisis many of us in the room lived through. There's also the fact that 2008 is when China really starts to take off and starts to threaten Western primacy in technologies and other economic sectors. In addition, and related to that, China's rapid growth really made raw materials more expensive because they were eating up all the raw materials, the market prices were going up. So for the first time since the 70s, Western policymakers were like, oh no, what if we can't access the oil, the copper, the beef, the soy, the whatever it was, the raw materials that we're used to. So that's the second moment. Now we get into contemporary history that all of us have lived through. So in 2016, in that time period from 2016 to 2020 in Trump's first government, he starts to make some early moves. And we don't always associate Trump and the energy transition because we think of him as a more pro-oil person, but he did some things that were very consequential. He named lithium a critical mineral. I don't know why he did it. He doesn't love electric vehicles, but he decided this is going to be a point of tension between us and China, and we got to claim this as something critical that is relevant to our national security, because they're already taking off with their lithium supply chain, so we have to beat them. So that happens in 2016. In addition, there's a bunch of trade wars with China, so the whole issue of like supply chains and renewable energy technology starts getting geopolitically intense. Fast forward to Biden, he really continues with this. I mean, people often say we have so much polarization in the US. It's true, but not on this topic. Democrats and Republicans tend to agree that China is a threat and we need to beat them on the technological front. That's the consensus that I was talking about before. And so Biden actually increases tariffs on China, especially on electric vehicle, critical mineral, battery products. And he also jumpstarts this whole set of policies to really bring lithium mining into the US and bring battery and EV manufacturing into the US. The same thing is happening in Europe with different language, different specific policies, but in Europe too, they're like, we can't let China win this game. And the way that China has won this, according to these policymakers, is by having the whole supply chain in China. Lithium, batteries, electric vehicles, they do it all. So we have to do the same thing in the West. Again, this is the discourse that I'm just, mimicking so that you get a feel for it. So I want to just step back in one other way, and then we'll return to those latter points. The idea that we should have a lot of lithium mining in the US or Europe is a major change. With the exception of fossil fuels in the US, we are nearly reliant on imports for basically every mineral. We are an importer of minerals. Yes, we have mines in the US, but our US economy is enormous. So the vast majority of our mineral needs come from importing copper, cobalt, nickel, graphite, whatever it is, rare earths from elsewhere. In Europe, it's even more the case. Europe, they have barely any mines. So the idea that Europe and the US are suddenly going to open up their landscapes to mining is a major shift. And we could maybe predict that such a big shift with the land use implications of that might get politically contentious, which we're going to talk about in a moment. But I just want you to be aware that this is a big shift. Yes, the US produces a lot of oil, but it is reliant on imports for major minerals. So what I began to start witnessing, and this is, first place where there are going to be a couple technical terms. Do not worry too much because you're going to get the main point because I'm going to say it out loud. But where I start seeing government actors in the US and European Union really create a whole policy paradigm to start building an entire supply chain within their borders. So they start doing what I call corporate-friendly industrial policy. What I mean by that is a set of policies to encourage corporate actors to invest in particular ways, not by saying you must do this or we're going to punish you if you don't do this. That's some of the stuff sometimes China might do, right? But actually by this more neoliberal, corporate-friendly, we'll give you a tax break if you do it. And so that's what the Inflation Reduction Act was for people that were paying attention to the news a few years ago, that Trump is in the process and the GOP are in the process of dismantling. But regardless, it was a major paradigm shift. And similar processes took place in Europe. So on the one hand, what we get are all of these policies and discourses that say we have to have the supply chains here and we're going to make it easier for corporations to do it. And then there's this interesting, like, we could call it greenwashing or we could take it more at face value, and I leave that to the audience to decide. But there's another set of discourses that even some of Trump's own officials in his first government would say, which is kind of bizarre to think of now, where they would say, not only are we going to outcompete China by building the supply chains here, we're going to do it more ethically. Ethically. I mean, that's a word that they use, and I'm emphasizing it because of the nature of this, our whole symposium today on ethics. We're going to do it more responsibly, we're going to do it more sustainably because we're the West, and we do it better. So it was a kind of two-pronged set of policy changes and discourses. And, you know, we could ask why this happens. I sort of already given you the argument, so this is a little bit redundant at this point. But a major thing was to outcompete China, so we need to make sure we have industrial policies to encourage lithium mining, battery manufacturing, et cetera, here. And the other thing, it's not just about national security, it's also that corporations along the supply chains benefit from these policies a lot because they amount to basically a lot of tax breaks and subsidies for them to set up lithium mines and the supply chain within the US. And in general, corporations also like this idea that if we do it in the West, it's more sustainable because that gave them a bit of reputational capital as well. So we get some major, now we're kind of picking up momentum in history and in the talk, right? Like that we're accelerating things. So we have a whole suite of policies in the US and EU that are aiming for something like mineral self-sufficiency and mining self-sufficiency and building an entire supply chain within the borders of these countries. And so these are some of the pieces of legislation. We're also going to do some protectionism. So there are tariffs to like make sure that we don't have to necessarily compete globally, but we're going to kind of have these homegrown companies and help them out with some trade protection. And then at some point, hopefully they'll be competitive. But so there are a bunch of tariffs put into place. Do not worry. The whole point of this is it's illegible because there's so much public money being thrown around. Right? And so in the European Union, but even more so in the US, because for various reasons that I'm happy to talk about, we have even more fiscal firepower than they do and a stronger currency and more room to maneuver there, lots of money. And I just want to note that at the very bottom, we also have some Trump 2 things, right? So Trump has not dropped this idea. He doesn't like electric vehicles, but he does like lithium mining and rare earth mining. To the point where actually recently the US government became the #1 shareholder in the US's only rare earth mine. That's under Trump. So the Pentagon owns 15% of the shares of the US's only rare earth mine in Mountain Pass, California. So that's the level at which this geopolitics is and the array of public policies meant to incentivize mining and to tie mining closely to national security. All of this is having effects on the ground. So now we're getting a little closer to our land use themes. So we are redrawing the map of lithium. This is the western United States, so you kind of see Utah, Colorado, California, Arizona, Nevada, et cetera. I did my fieldwork in Nevada. At the height of this frenzy, which has calmed down for the moment, but it'll pick back up most likely, there were 100 different mining claims, 100 different mining projects with permits or with financing behind them at early stages, right? Most of these projects won't move forward, but even if there's 10 megamines in the western US, that's an enormous change of how we use our land, right? And so there was a flurry of investment because governments, right and left, you know, Trump to Biden, Europe to US, were saying, this is open for business. Like, we need to extract lithium. And in Europe too, again, where I said there's been almost no mining for like a century, aside from putting aside coal mining, but no metallic mining, a bunch of new mining projects were also opened up. So this is redrawing the global map of extraction. And this is only part of the story, because I've been focusing on the global north. We started in Chile, then we went to the global north. We're going to go back to the global south. We're going to jump around the map a little bit. But I want to tell us right away that even with all this new mining in the global north, there's a lot of new projects in the global south. And in fact, some of those are happening even faster. So we have new projects in Brazil, in Zimbabwe, in Argentina, in addition to in the pre-existing producers that were dominant, Australia, Chile. So we have tons of lithium mining everywhere in the world, new extractive frontiers being opened up. And this is a kind of technical term, but it's an interesting one to think with. The fact that there's more mining in the global north doesn't mean that the inequalities of mining have gone away. So I'm using this term unequal ecological exchange. It's also sometimes just unequal exchange. So I'm just, for those of you that are familiar with that language, you'll know what I'm talking about. But there's more mining in the north, there's more mining in the south as well. There's more mining everywhere for the energy transition as well as for other advanced technologies. So that might raise the question, what are all the corporations doing? And so we're going to come to them. But I want to start with just a conceptual piece of when I talk about green capitalism, my book is called The Extraction, the Frontiers of Green Capitalism. I get different responses to that term. Some people like it. They're like, of course capitalism can be green. We can have sustainable capitalism. We can innovate our way into sustainability. So that's that first piece. We can internalize the externalities. That's for the economists in the room. But what it means is the externalities, the negative impacts of capitalism can actually be kind of priced in, and capitalism can self-modify to be more sustainable. Then a whole other set of people are like, there's no such thing as green capitalism. What are you talking about? Capitalism can never be green. And there's a kernel of truth in the second one, but I think it's a little too quick and easy. So what I want to do instead is think about specifically what sectors and companies and investors and supply chains do we mean when we talk about green capitalism. So I'm more interested in what I would call an empirical definition of it that allows me to study it on the ground, and then I'll judge it later, which I'm happy to do, and we will do in this talk, right? And there is a lot of greenwashing. But I first want to know, what are we talking about when we use the word green applied to the economy? And so what I've defined it as, and this is a definition I came up for my book, is just any technology where there's a claim made that it's going to help with the climate crisis, it's going to help with environmental issues, whether that's proven or not. So we've got unproven geoengineering, and we've got proven lithium batteries. Lithium batteries work. There's no speculative aspect of them. That doesn't mean they have no environmental costs, but they function as advertised. Geoengineering, we're not so sure about. But all of these I refer to as green because someone in the investment or governmental world has labeled them as such. But I also want to attend to the politics. I know I keep repeating, I'm a political scientist, so I'm very interested in what are the political stakes of this. There's also another angle to green capitalism, which is important not to miss, is that it is a political project. What I mean by that is it itself is an argument. It says we don't need to change capitalism to address the climate crisis. We just need to nudge the policies, nudge the investors, get corporations to do slightly better, get consumers to switch what they buy, and then we'll solve this all. So we can kind of have most of the status quo, nothing in this room needs to change except the fact that our lights are powered by solar, right? And so it's a political gambit, I would say, and one that actually we could question whether it's politically successful or not in the US right now, but we can talk about that later. So when I look at my sectors, the sectors I'm looking at are lithium firms, battery, EVs. Primarily, I'm more focused on the lithium, but the other parts of the supply chain are important. And when I say political project, it's all of those policies that we already went through. But how are corporations dealing with all of the stuff I just talked about, the geopolitics, the volatility, what are corporations doing? One thing they're doing, and I know this is the next two slides most technical in this whole thing. Then we're going to get into social movements and all sorts of other stuff. So, but this is the most technical term, so I'm just a little warning. But it's interesting, so maybe bear with me for a moment, which is that what corporations are doing is saying, just like politicians don't trust free trade anymore, don't trust global cooperation, are worried about the world, are worried about geopolitical conflict, we too as corporations are as well. We're worried we suddenly won't have access to lithium somewhere because there's some kind of war going on. We're going to start directly investing in lithium ourselves. And this is kind of fascinating. So what you have on the left side, Tesla, Hyundai, Volkswagen, Daimler, General Motors, these are car companies. All of these car companies have direct investments in lithium mines in one way or another. That is a change. For those older folks in the room or historians in the room, we might remember back in the day someone named Henry Ford. What Henry Ford's innovation was is he had the whole vertical integration, the whole supply chain. He did his own coal, his own steel. He tried to do his own rubber. That didn't work out. But the idea that, then neoliberalism and global trade and neoliberal globalization changed all of that and everything was outsourced. Now it's like a return to Fordism. So these companies downstream, meaning lower down the supply chain in terms of they're the buyers of lithium, are now not trusting the market, and so they're directly investing to make sure they have their own lithium supply. That Mountain Pass mine that I referred to, the rare earths one, so a different mineral, Apple and other tech companies are directly investing along with the Pentagon because they want to make sure they get their cut. So this is the geopolitics inflecting economics, if that makes sense. This I'm probably going to skip for now, but for folks that are interested, we can talk later. There's all sorts of interesting ways in which commodity markets are coming into being and new forms of financialization. I'll kind of just gloss over that for now. This last part is a little more interesting to others. There's one other thing. I've mentioned the word greenwashing a few times. So another thing that companies are doing, both lithium companies and the EV companies they sell to, is making a big fuss about our lithium is green, it's sustainable, we promise. We got it certified by someone that we paid to do that. Anyway, but it's a clue that it's important to them. And the reason it's important is a little bit about, they think some consumers of EVs are like ethical consumers, but it's also because there's so much social conflict over mining that they need to address the environmental harm piece. So again, we'll come back to the social conflict, but just so we know how the corporate world is responding. There's all sorts of interesting contradictions here too, right? So I'll just list a couple of them and I'll just highlight one or two as speaking out loud, which is that, what do the corporations think of all those state policies I listed? They hate the tariffs, but they love the tax cuts, right? But the policymakers are combining those things, but the corporations really, one of them is not so great for them and the other is. So there are interesting contradictions in this political project. There's the fact that firms want to say they're sustainable, but they don't want real environmental regulation, right? And so, there's a lot of interesting conflict even within the corporate world and within the elite political world as well, let alone within the world of communities and social movements. That will be our kind of last piece. But as I've been previewing, the powerful actors in the world are not the only actors. And they're really not here, because a lot of what they're doing is also in response to less powerful actors, whether less powerful states or less powerful communities. So I'm going to start briefly with the Global South and what's happening there. Because a lot of my fieldwork was in Chile. I focus a bit on the US because I think it's of interest to this audience, but I'm going to kind of take us back to Latin America and to the Global South. And what we see there is, just like I said, that there's this whole thing about securing supply chains, governments intervening in supply chains, trying to get corporations to do certain things. In the Global South, there are similar things, but we use a different language for it called resource nationalism. And what we have in the Global South is almost like that 70s moment again. So I said earlier, in the 70s, there was all these Global South states were nationalizing their resources. OPEC was created in 1960. That whole moment, it's like back in style. So Global South states with lithium, I'll come to that in a second. Global South states with lithium are starting to establish state-owned mining companies because they want to make sure they get a cut of the pie too. And they're not wrong to care about that because most of the minerals for the energy transition are going to come from the Global South. Despite all the new mines in the US, Canada, the UK, Europe, still the bulk of raw materials for the energy transition, when we look at copper, at lithium and nickel, all these, it's Latin America, it's Indonesia, and it's Africa. Those are the top 3 sources of these raw materials. So they want to make sure that if they're going to be providing raw materials for this global economy, that they benefit from it. And one of the ways to do that, or to attempt to do that, is to intervene more directly, nationalize sectors, establish state-owned companies, negotiate new contracts. And so that's exactly what they've been doing. And this is just a list, a sort of set of examples. There's even been talk of, let's establish a lithium OPEC in South America. Like, let's coordinate around pricing and production the way OPEC does for oil, but with lithium. So that's been, just to give you a flavor of what's going on. But this is not easy in the Global South. There's a lot more policy and financial room for maneuver in the Global North. In the Global South, the trade-offs are more stark when you try to make these interventions. So, maybe you want to kind of intervene in raw materials to make sure you profit more for them, but the real profit is not in the mining. It's in the EV, it's in the battery, it's in the downstream high-tech stuff. And so there's this kind of trade-off, which I'm calling a developmental trade-off, which is like, you want to actually get to those higher stages of production, but how do you do that? It's hard. Geopolitics, there's this whole thing where China and the West are at odds with one another. is that good for global South countries? Do competing elites kind of maybe give them some new openings? Or are they going to be the kind of sacrifice zones of this competition? So there's geopolitical issues, distributive issues, right? Like their societies want to make sure that the mining benefits the society, not just like the corporations or not just the state actors. And so there's the question of how do we distribute the economic benefits of mining? And lastly, and this is where we're going to go next, and kind of to conclude the talk, there's a huge socio-environmental conflict. Because especially in Latin America, but also in Africa and South Asia, there's mounting environmental grievances over the level of extraction and extractivism in those places. And governments might be well-intentioned in saying, we want to make sure we get a cut of this critical minerals pie, and we want to make sure we develop our own supply chains and companies. But they're getting environmental protest over those same things, and that can put them in a bit of a bind. And so now we're going to turn to social movements, which is kind of the last part of this talk, but I think a good place to end because I think it opens up maybe some of the most interesting questions, at least for me, which is that it turns out that wherever you start extracting lithium, the protest follows, right? And so what we've seen is that the lithium extraction, which really started in the earlier 2000s, or the current wave of it in the earlier 2000s in Chile, Argentina, Bolivia, those were the first places we got protests. So we got initial lithium investments in those places and protests followed. Then it moves to the global north because now there's lithium mining in the global north, in Nevada, in Spain, in Portugal. As soon as lithium mines start to be licensed in those places, you get protests. I'm being a little facetious here, so it's not so automatic. Of course, not every community protests mining. But what I'm saying is in broad strokes, the kind of idea that, oh, if we have more mining in the global north, it's going to be more sustainable, more ethical, and no one's going to protest, that hasn't been true. And in the global south, this idea of like, oh, if we get the perfect resource nationalist policy, society will be satisfied, that's also not true. Communities increasingly do not like mining because they're increasingly aware of its environmental impacts, much more so than they were a couple of decades ago. And so the contention just keeps getting kind of relit wherever the lithium frontier travels. And so these are some examples of types of protests. So folks that study social movements or are familiar with them might recognize that, like, you know, we have some direct action up here. We have the blockade of an attempt to mine lithium. We have some kind of like typical protest in a big city. So in Lisbon, Portugal, the protest got so big that it wasn't just in the local community. People in the capital city were turning out, right? Similar in Belgrade, Serbia, where actually anti-lithium protests became part of a huge kind of national protest movement. And then in Nevada, you had a very interesting protest camp set up that I visited and a set of lawsuits against one of the major mines there. And what I like to do in my own study, and to sort of, again, re-emphasize this piece about the contention over land use and the different meanings of the land. One of the things that's most interesting about studying mining is to go to a community that's been designated for a mine, but the mine hasn't been built yet, and to see how people are thinking about the extractive future ahead of them. And we actually get some of the most militant, interesting, visionary types of protests before the mine even starts. And so these were places that I went to in Nevada and in Portugal, in addition to the study in Chile that I already mentioned, where communities were trying to prevent something from happening. The mining hadn't begun, but they were very worried about it occurring at all, because these landscapes would be totally different. This is like a small farmer community that would be completely transformed by an enormous large-scale lithium mine. And this is considered sacred indigenous territory. It wouldn't have the same cultural or spiritual resonance if there's a huge lithium mine on top of it, right? And so the concerns were very existential in both cases. And so what I argue, a kind of, you know, this is the second time I've said I'm going to make an argument, so this is another argument, which is that, you know, we have to look at these social movements to understand even the economics, right? So if I'm talking to someone that's more interested in like the business press or in kind of high-level elite politics, like I would say that these social movements are reshaping supply chains. How? By stopping a lithium mine from happening, by stalling it, by slowing it down. That can put upward pressure on prices because there's less lithium supply if every lithium mine is under protest. Exaggerating to make a point, but just so you get the idea. So these social movements, whether it's their goal or not, are taking a role in shaping the global political economy of lithium and the supply chains that it feeds into. And they also have lots of interesting ideas. And, you know, I could do a whole presentation, and I have, but I want to sort of give the rest of the context. But this stuff is super interesting. So people protesting lithium mining or what they call green extractivism, that's their term, a term that I heard in Chile, in Portugal, and Nevada, say, you know, the community should have a right to decide. Not only do communities have rights, nature should have a right, which is, by the way, recognized in multiple Latin American constitutions, that like nature should have a right. Communities should have a role in planning these supply chains. We shouldn't just be like subjected to a mine or not, depending on what elites decide. So it's a very vibrant culture and a very oppositional culture at some of these protest sites. The last thing, and we're in the second to last slide, so thank you for bearing with me, is that, you know, I've kind of hinted at this, but I want to say it a little bit more frontally. If the fact of the matter is that mining in the global south causes protest, mining in the global north causes protest, that many communities and many people probably sitting in this room would not love to live next to a contaminating, enormous, noisy, large-scale mine that maybe they don't immediately benefit from. If that's the case, then like, what are we going to do about that? Like, what is the solution to that? There's a lot of specific governance interventions, and I am in favor of a whole number of public policies that could improve community benefit, increase community consultation. We can talk about all of that. But there's a more fundamental material issue which really gets to the question of the ethics of land use, which is, what is the total material footprint of mining that we're envisioning here? Mining is already an enormous global sector, taking over huge swaths of territory. Now we're even talking about mining in the deep seas. People may have heard news items about this, but some of these critical minerals exist in nodules on the seabed, so we're gonna tear up our oceans. Maybe we'll finally mine the asteroids and outer space, right? So the frontiers just keep growing and getting more sci-fi, but it's like a reality that we're living in. It's not science fiction. And so that, I think, raises the question of, like, what would an ethical approach to deciding how much land, how much mining, how many extractive inputs we need for what is very urgently needed, which is a zero emissions economy, which I'm totally in favor of, right? I'm not against the energy transition at all. But it's a question of how and for who, right? Those critical normative questions that I brought up at the beginning of the talk. And so I'm gonna end with this final slide, which answers that question, I think, or is an answer to that question. And I had the privilege of collaborating with a bunch of other researchers a couple of years ago with a think tank that I work with. And we asked a simple question that no one had asked, and I'm not even kidding, like no one had asked it before. It kind of boggles the mind. Is there a way to get to zero emissions transportation, in this case, without, not with less mining, like we're gonna need some more lithium mining. Even for my perfect society, we need more than we have right now, but without as much as like forecast by these crazy forecasts that we need, for example, 300 new mines in the next decade just for car batteries. 300 new mines, like just for car batteries, not for solar panels, not for wind turbines, like enormous quantities of mining are being predicted. Is there a way to get to the end goal without so much extraction? And what we found out was yes. And it's shocking, first of all, that no one had done this study before. This study occurred to me my first month of field work. So I was like, there must be another way. And I just kept doing Google Scholar, and I'm like, why is not, like a scientist not figured this out yet, right? And no one had. And so then I had the privilege of joining a think tank and having access to other collaborators and resources to do the project. And we did a whole quantitative model using totally standard modeling techniques, but asking different questions, which is, can we get to a climate-safe world without rapacious amounts of extraction? And again, in just very short, the answer is yes. We can get to a world that includes EVs, but also includes electric buses and electric bikes and walkability and all sorts of modes of transportation, in which maybe the electric vehicles are not Hummer size and they're more normal size, right? If we do those types of changes and a bunch of other parameters and little things we fiddle around with, we can use dramatically less lithium, and I would say get to our goals faster, because the path we're on is not the fastest path. Expecting every American to buy an EV tomorrow is probably not reasonable. But what if the bus ran every minute? Maybe you'd leave the car at home once in a while, right? So there are other options that are even faster in the near term that address the climate crisis and the ecological crisis with a normative and social justice framework of what the most ethical energy transition might look like that is empirically viable. The question is how we make it politically possible. Thank you so much.
So we have time for some questions, and we'll pass the mic around. When you are asking the question, please use the mic so that we collect that information. Collect the information? That's not what I meant. Just so that you could hear it on the video. Collect your information. That's what we're doing. Really some crazy stuff going on. We have a question? Yeah. Stop me. Thank you.
Hi. Yeah, I give you permission to use this information. No, actually, you were talking at the beginning about the question of extraction for whom, yeah. And you end with the notion of sort of extracting for like a Hummer size yes. EV. So I'm wondering if you have some thoughts, maybe even a little bit off the top of your head, about the sort of extracting, say, from Chile to provide, like how much of that is going into the hands of consumers or producers, corporate producers that are producing for a particularly unequally distributed wealth, even in the global north, if you have some thoughts on that.
Should I take that one to start with? Okay.
Yes.
Great. So I think I understood the question. Just like stop me if I didn't, and you can repeat. But let me take a stab at this. So one weigh-in is that we know from a bunch of studies that the study that you're asking for hasn't been done about lithium. Because I think what the question asker is getting at is like, can we actually trace like how much lithium, especially from more impoverished, more marginalized global south communities, is then making its way into the consumption of some of the wealthiest people in the world, right? Do I more or less have you right? In the wealthiest nations, right. Okay, great. So we don't have that study for lithium, but we do have it for other metals. So I think we can extrapolate. And what we know, and I cite this study in my book because I was actually surprised at how stark it was, is that basically the vast, vast, vast majority of industrial metals, of metals used in industrial purposes, are used in products by like the top 10%, 20% of consumers in the world. That they didn't disaggregate global north and south, but we can kind of make assumptions there. So let me put that in more normal language for everyone else, which is to say that like the people suffering the harms of mining are not the people that benefit from the end-use products that those minerals furnish. And the people that most benefit from the end-use products are not the people being impacted by mining. So when we say, I'm going to just take this opportunity to just make one other point, which is not directly what you're asking, but it kind of prompts it, which is, you know, there's all this talk about, as I discussed in the talk today, about onshoring, we need to bring supply chains home. And, you know, sometimes people ask me, isn't that more just? And I think there's a kernel of truth there, which is to say, like, globally, the map of extraction is so unjust because the people living near the cobalt mine, the copper mine, the nickel mine never see the electric vehicle, or not anytime soon, most likely. And they get tons of toxic environmental harm. And so sure, in theory, like let's bring the extraction closer to the production and closer to where the end-use consumption is happening. But the mines aren't in Silicon Valley. They're not on Wall Street. They're not at the National Mall. The mines are in Nevada, layered on top of centuries of indigenous dispossession and like still harm from like mercury mining, nuclear testing, right? So we have to, you know, a phrase I like to use is like, inequality is fractal. It's at every single scale. So when we think about where the siting of mining and the land use decisions are, oftentimes when mining is, okay, brought into the global north, it affects like the worst off communities within the global north. So that's not justice, nor does it help the Chileans at all, right? So I think I'm not opposed at all to like regionalizing or localizing supply chains. There's a lot of climate logic to that. We shouldn't be shipping huge mountains of mining ore all over the earth in container ships using bunker fuel, polluting the atmosphere. Like I'm okay with like bringing things closer together, but the question is who? And who pays the cost, who benefits, right? And those need to be equalized, not just like the geography of mining.
Oh, you can hear me. Awesome. You mentioned, or it was in your graphs up that you had up there, it talked about sort of the best case scenario, reduced vehicle ownership, reducing the size of batteries, bringing cities sort of closer together, just to reduce, I think, general energy usage and that sort of thing so that you wouldn't need as much mining. That was your best case scenario. I wonder if you did any speculation on how that would be achieved and over what time frame.
Yeah, it's a great question, and sorry, I lost access to the laptop, but we can remember what the person's asking about. It was the last slide that kind of showed these different outcomes of transportation policy choices and built environment choices, right? Like how much density versus how much sprawl. I didn't even mention that, but you were very smart to pick up on it. That like one of the factors that was pivotal, in addition to like how big is the car, are people driving versus taking a bus, is like how close together are our buildings. Because when buildings are really far apart, like they are in the suburbs of the US, people drive more and they buy more vehicles. When you can walk from place to place, vehicle ownership rates go down anywhere in the world, right? And so these are real choices about how do we design. You know, we're talking about environments, like environmental landscapes, but these are like the built environments, the infrastructures of our cities and suburbs and towns, and how do we design those differently? So, okay, huge question, because Americans, you know, we could say Americans are addicted to driving, but I think that's the wrong way to think about it. It's not an addiction, and I was telling the story, so excuse the students that I met earlier and told this little anecdote to, but you know, most places in the US, it's very hard to live without a car. It's not really an individual choice. Like, I would personally prefer to commute to work on a commuter rail or light rail and like have my coffee and like do my lesson planning on my way to work and have a chill ride rather than like be in traffic and like hate everyone around me. Like, I don't actually want to drive. I'm from New York City. I didn't even have a driver's license until I was 31, but I have to drive in Providence, Rhode Island, even though it's a city, the transit system sucks and whatever. So it's a real question, but I'm kind of saying two things here. One is that we shouldn't overly naturalize the American love affair of the car, in the sense that like, I don't think most Americans have other choices to make. In most places, you're a second-class citizen if you don't own a car. And like anyone that's ever been in that situation knows exactly what I mean. So I don't think it's a choice people are actively making. And I think a lot of the love affair stuff, you know, a lot of industry PR has gone into like making Americans think that when they're driving, it's on the open road. It's like all of us are in traffic all the time, and it's terrible. Not only that, the US has the worst, and it's getting worse, and it's very sad, traffic fatalities in the world. It's like totally disproportionate to population, to anything. We're like off the charts in terms of people dying from traffic accidents, right? So there's a public safety angle too. So I'm joining on a bit, but it's to say that like there's a lot of ways to unpack like both why we use cars so much and what disastrous implications from climate to safety that has. And then I think there's a lot of ways in, because once you jumpstart the process, and as someone that lives and breathes politics, I never downplay the difficulty of politics, but also I don't want to downplay like the creative openings that can sometimes happen. Once you jumpstart the process and you improve people's transit options, every study shows that people start taking transit more. Then you get into a positive feedback loop, and people want to fund it more, and it's no longer a stigmatized thing to ride the bus like it is in the US in so many places. In London, in Paris, in Amsterdam, and Barcelona, they were on track to be like US-level car driving like a couple decades ago. All of them instituted policies from congestion pricing, which we have in New York now, which is already having really positive impacts. Ridership of transit is going up, driving is going down, traffic is alleviated, pollution is clearing. Like, we just instituted congestion pricing like a year ago, and it's already changing New York City. Of course, a place that already had transit infrastructure, but we need to start with the low-hanging fruit. I'm not saying go to the rural Arkansas and like start building out your bus system. Like, let's start with our metro areas that have been starved of transit funding, and if we just refund a little bit, you can get that positive cycle going, right? And so now, you know, in all those global cities that I just named, and we could go, you know, to East Asia as well for some interesting examples, with some interesting policies, they were able to really jumpstart public transit use and pedestrian safety. And so we just have to look for places where that's already politically viable. And I don't want to get too partisan, but like maybe that's the blue city or state, or maybe that's the place that already kind of has a commuter rail network, but it's been defunded. And so I'm happy to chat about this more, but I do think there are ways around this problem. I would say Minnesota, of all places, has done amazing stuff to revitalize their transit system and decrease car use. So there are places that it's happening. Colorado sold out of e-bike subsidies like the day that they put them on the market, right? So if you give people money or you make it easier for them, they'll do it. But you know, our politicians don't always think that way.
Okay, so I think it's
Are we out of time?
6:15.
I have no
Yeah,
idea what time it
I
is.
think it's about 6:15. Yes, so
Okay.
let's break.
Well, thank you
We're
so
going to go over to the Reeves Museum if you want to. Thank you so much. And Thea will be happy to answer questions in the reception, at the reception.
I